I think the veganism on a personal level is kind of an attempt to turn the volume down a little bit on the cacophony of trauma that we're all just kind of stewing in this society, right? Which helps give you a little space to start repairing things little by little. If there's one less thing I have to worry about, which is, contributing to the animal industry, it's one piece of the self-soothing that I've developed over the course of my life.
As a vegan, do you ever feel like you're living in a parallel universe, aware of things that many others don't even seem to notice, let alone acknowledge? I'm Chrissy Benson, host of the Vegan Posse podcast. We talk with vegans from around the globe who, like you, are living lives of integrity and compassion with an eye toward justice. Through their personal stories, you'll come to see that you're not an outlier. In fact, you're part of an entire posse of individuals who aren't just keeping the peace, they're creating it through their food choices and beyond. You won't be saddling up, but you're in for the ride of your life. Welcome to the Vegan Posse. Hey Posse, I'm Chrissy Benson, host of the Vegan Posse, bringing vegans together to help animals everywhere. As always, we're coming to you from Music City, Nashville, Tennessee, and we've got just a few announcements. First of all, join me at this year's Vegan Summerfest in Johnstown, Pennsylvania, July 9th through the 13th, 2025. It's going to be amazing. Next, help make the vegan women's fiction classic, my novel Marrying Myself by me, christinembenson, an international bestseller, by picking up lots of copies for yourself and your friends and family on Amazon or at my website, christinembenson.com. Together, we can normalize veganism through the arts. If you're looking for help in getting your act together, and yes, that's a pun on one of my favorite therapeutic frameworks, acceptance and commitment therapy, aka ACT, reach out to me directly for personal coaching via my email, christinembenson@gmail.com. And if you've got questions, comments, or topic suggestions for the monthly series Posse Talk with Jen Hawk, send them to veganposse.email@gmail.com. And finally, if you value the work that we do here at the Posse, consider becoming a financial supporter. You can make your contribution through Venmo or PayPal to Vegan Posse. And now for this week's episode. Again, one of the things I love most about being a vegan is the amazing people I end up intersecting with, including this week's guest, Nachie Braga, founder of the permaculture company Geomancer in Lexington, Kentucky, which specifically promotes a Marxist approach to permaculture. Whatever you know or do not know about permaculture and or Marxism, I guarantee you there's plenty of food for thought and lots to chew on in this conversation with Nachie. So enjoy. Nachie, welcome to the Vegan Posse. Are you ready for the ride of your life?
The ride of my life. Yes, absolutely.
Awesome. So let's take it back to the very beginning. I love to hear about where people grew up and if they ever thought about the animals in our food system growing up.
Yeah, so I grew up just a little bit in Brazil, actually. I was born there and probably did what would be the equivalent of like first grade over there before coming to the United States, and then kind of spending the rest of my childhood in Maryland and DC area. And I guess I'd never really thought about the animals from a philosophical point of view until I was probably 15 or something. In fact, I have like vivid memories of going out in the back of my mother's family actually had a little bit of land that we would go visit sometimes, and like bees nests and hives and things like that I would find in the garden, and just like stomping these bees and having this afternoon of like, oh, I have to get rid of these bees and things like that. So a very sort of disconnected view, I think. And also, growing up in Brazil, a lot of people, especially in the United States, kind of had this idea that somehow we were in the jungle or something. And no, it was, Sao Paulo, just an enormous industrial city. So very disconnected from nature, which is pretty interesting. Based on what I do now in my field, I run into a lot of people who do what I do, and they usually have this story of like having grown up on a farm and this kind of connection that was always nascent there. But I have nothing like that, to be honest.
Yeah, yeah, that is so interesting. So, how did you stumble into permaculture? How did you first get drawn to that?
Well, so permaculture, interestingly enough, was well after I had been vegan for a while, but I got into permaculture through the route of wilderness survival, kind of
Ah,
studying, which is a very loaded term, but it is kind of a distinct industry. It's a distinct field of study, at least in North America, and I got into that probably in my early 20s, after quite a bout of different types of social justice activism, I guess you could call it.
okay.
The anti-globalization movement was pretty active in my youth. Just all sorts of things around that time, early 2000s, late 90s, and the wilderness survival was kind of it was one of those. I think a lot of us go through these periods of engagement and then disenchantment with social movements, with trying to build community, all these kinds of things. And so you often hear the refrain of, well, screw everyone, I'm just going to go live in a cabin in the mountains by myself, or whatever it is. And then so I was kind of in a period of my life where that unfortunately was sort of my thinking. And so I decided, I have to learn what kind of plants can I eat, what can I make out of medicine if I'm going to just live, on the mountain by myself, so to speak. And fortunately, I was learning from a lineage in kind of that wilderness survival tradition that was always very open and honest about the fact that what we were learning was just indigenous life skills, indigenous life ways, and that there was a lot more to that culture and to those practices than just quote unquote wilderness survival.
That is so interesting. Okay, so I need to hear some of the backstory because it sounds like there was a lot that brought you to that point where you wanted to go live in the cabin in the woods. Well, first of all, when did you go vegan? What sparked that change?
Yeah, so I think this year I've been vegan 18 years, and I think I was 22 maybe. And unfortunately, I will say, probably from about the time I was 15, I understood that in order to be in accordance with my political ideas, I would at some point have to be vegan.
So you
And
had strongly held political ideas even at 15.
absolutely, yeah,
What were
yeah. And
they?
so, well, I've been I guess what you could call an orthodox Marxist, or a
Okay.
communist, pretty much my entire life. And there was a little zine that I read, a pamphlet when I was 15. It's called Beasts of Burden. Beasts of Burden. The subtitle is Capitalism, Animals, Communism. Are you familiar with it?
It sounds familiar, but I have not read it. No.
Yeah, it's it came out, I want to say, in the 80s, probably written in Britain. And there's a variety of things in there, especially like some anthropological claims that I think don't really hold up with what
Okay.
archaeology is saying in the present day. But just a really kind of an inflammatory tract that really brought out some of the questions that, if communism is this really all-encompassing kind of reimagining of our relationship to everything else in the world, certainly to each other, um, animals have to be, our relationship with animals have to be reconsidered as part of that. And so having that discussion really kind of articulated in that text, early on in my political awakening, I was like, of course, yes, this is obvious. And I also kind of had the benefit of coming up a little bit around like the hardcore scene in DC, and being, in a subculture where veganism was to some extent present. So I was at least aware of it, and kind of had access to different kind of materials. We saw a lot of stuff around Animal Liberation Front, et cetera, was just very
Hmm.
much the kind of in the vernacular at the
Okay.
time. So but like I said, then it took me, 7 years, I think maybe 6 years to go vegetarian, and so I'll always regret that. That was like, oh, I
Hmm.
should have gone vegan, as a teenager, and my conviction, frankly, wasn't there.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure the people around you weren't vegan or even vegetarian, so it's
No, no, and actually, I grew up a pretty picky eater, and
mm.
I ate a lot of like chicken nuggets and stuff like that. So it was, but it was interesting. I think like a lot of people, once I noticed like the changes in my body, from not consuming animals anymore, I was like, oh, I smell different. All these things that I thought were
Huh.
just normal kind of human experience. I was like, no, that's because I was, you know, putting corpses in my body, and
Right.
it's been a massive evolution. People always ask, why are you vegan? I'm sure you get that question constantly, and it's every possible reason, right? But it started out much more of a political ethic than a animal liberation ethic. Um, and I would say as well, at that period of my life, I was an atheist. I'm very much no longer an atheist, and at this
Mm.
point, veganism is as much, or maybe more so, a spiritual kind of interpretation for me as anything else.
So interesting. And the people around you, do you have brothers and sisters?
I do have an older sister.
And so was she on a similar path at all?
No,
No?
no, not at
Okay.
all. They. I will say, my parents, and my sister now, when I go visit her family and everything, they've been pretty supportive. At least in terms of consideration for having food around, or
Hmm.
whatever. But actually, the funniest story with my sister is when she got married. They had the event catered and all this kind of stuff, and I flew out for it. And of course, there was a couple vegan dishes, and one of them was fried green tomato sliders. These things were delicious, and they were gone by the time I went to get seconds. So everybody else, all the omnivores went for and destroyed the vegan stuff, and then I didn't get any. So, but that's classic, right? And it's a kind of a good advertisement for the vegan food. But I do joke about that with her, that next time we have to have a little more.
That's great. And how about your parents? What did they think? They had this young rebel on their hands.
Yeah, like that's a whole uh, complicated history of adolescence and everything, right? And sort of like a reapproachment with them in my mid 20s, and kind of still always a relationship that we're working on. They still live in Brazil. My sister lives here in the United States, but the whole rest of the family, is back there. So I see them every couple of years or so. I would say, the veganism, certainly the veganism thing, being in my early 20s, I was long gone. It didn't really affect them
Okay.
directly in any way. The political radicalism, which was, some of that, the opening stages of that were under their roof. There was rocky bits there. It's interesting though, because uh, we could actually, I don't know if she even knows this necessarily, but my mother is kind of to blame for the fact that I became a communist. Um, and actually, it's kind of in my lineage. It's in my blood, to some extent, uh, or libertarian communism is, because actually, I think I don't remember how this came up, but in some kind of conversation with my mother when I was a teenager, she mentioned that some of our ancestors had fought in the Spanish Civil War, and I said, Spain had a civil war? What? I'd never heard of this. So she said, "Oh yeah, hold on." So she like ran upstairs for a second and came back, and she brought me a copy of George Orwell's Homage to Catalonia, which was basically my mother's side of the family. Her mother, they came from Barcelona. They came from that region of Spain. Their family was heavily involved in the syndicalist movement, and basically fought in several battles of the revolution and the civil war. So there's like these stories of the family dog went to the front in the trenches, and it could hear the German bombers coming before anyone else, so it would warn them. And learning about this really kind of saved my life, because I was depressed. I was very much on a trajectory of, what on earth are we even doing? Like, what is the point of this civilization? Why would I get a job? Why would I contribute to this? And then learning that there was a history of people who were actually trying to save the world
Mm.
is, it completely changed the course of my life.
And what age were you at that point?
That was like 15. Yeah.
15. Wow. So
Mhm.
you were really struggling with existential questions from a very young age.
Yeah. I would say from like the age of 8 on, to be honest, very, just frustration with the state of the world, and kind of, not things that I was able to articulate at that stage, of course, but yeah, very existential kind of, questions.
Like, what were the things that bothered you?
Well, I mean, the same things that would bother any kid, right? But like having to go to school, and this kind of thing. And I think, um, later, what I would come to maybe just understand is being hypersensitive, having hypervigilance, which directly ties into the veganism thing, because I think the veganism on a personal level is a response to those things, and kind of an attempt to turn the volume down a little bit on the cacophony of trauma that we're all just kind of stewing in this society, right? Which helps give you a little space to start repairing things little by little. If there's one less thing I have to worry about, which is, contributing to the animal industry, it's one piece of like the self-soothing that I've developed over the course of my life. But I think, it's all of it. I mean, my goodness, I can remember as a kid, like the hum of the fluorescent lights in the classroom. We're like, is this drilling into my bones? Like, this doesn't feel
Mm.
good. And
Mm.
so, and a lot of that is just psychosomatic stuff, but it is that level of, kind of discomfort in society as a whole,
Mm.
and not having much of a roadmap in terms of like, well, what are you supposed to do with this? Or like evolutionarily, what is the point of feeling this way?
Mm.
How am I supposed to be useful?
Mm. Mm. So what did you come up with? What was your path? Did you go to college?
No, I mean, well, eventually, yes, I did. I was a non-traditional student. I got a degree, an associate's degree, and moved on, and actually got a 4-year degree and then a master's, in my 30s, which was a fantastic, actually, experience, but
Mm.
really also the course of like not having anything left to do at the end of my 20s, like kind of running out of tricks, because what I tried to do was, overthrow the government and, destroy capitalism, and I just kind of went out, traveled around. I did a little bit of stuff internationally, but mostly East Coast, West Coast of the United States. And basically, I would wait for the next community to invite me, and I'd go to a different city every 6 months to a year, and help, with different kinds of trainings, help with different kinds of organizing. So I've been involved in, anti-racist stuff, housing stuff, food access kind of things, for a really long time. And then all of that kind of feeds back into what do I do professionally now, or informs it. So it wasn't a coherent strategy that I pursued. I kind of ran away and joined the circus, except, the circus was the sort of sophomoric leftist, kind of counterculture. And so I ran around with that for a while, um, and came in and out of that, and had periods of disengagement. As I mentioned, during one of those, I went and started studying wilderness survival, and thankfully learned about permaculture from that. But even that was in 2009. So I got
Mm.
my first, what we call kind of the foundational accreditation of a permaculture designer, your PDC. It's just like a 72-hour, pretty basic training. But I got that in 2010. I didn't start Geomancer, the company, until 2018, 2019. So there was a long period
Mm.
there of having absolutely no idea how to apply these ideas.
Mm.
And I think that's pretty common for a lot of people who study permaculture, for sure.
Yeah, and again, what was it like and what is it like being vegan in these circles? Because most of the number one, most of the revolutionaries I meet are not vegan. I've never heard Marxism associated with veganism, and just in permaculture, most people don't seem to be vegan.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say there's more vegans in like the left wing activist space than maybe in permaculture. Um, you know, actually, when I moved to Kentucky, which is, where I am now, I'm in central Kentucky and obviously didn't grow up here. But they were one of these communities that had invited me to come help out. They had just started a bookstore and a venue where they were having a lot of shows and that kind of stuff, hardcore underground punk shows, do it yourself type stuff. And all of those kids were vegan straight edge. So they,
Mm.
don't drink, don't do drugs, and don't consume animals. And that was like the whole basis of that little subculture there. And so I show up and, like, I drink, I don't care, whatever. And, and at that time I was just vegetarian as well. But I was there to help them with their kind of community organizing efforts. So I actually found, for the most part, that community was never too much of a problem. It was
Mm.
almost taken for granted in a lot of ways that, the potluck was going to be vegan, or you were supposed to label things as being vegan, because
Mm.
it was just kind of always there, especially in the kind of the music related scene. Um, and a lot of the work we did too, like Food Not Bombs, if you're familiar with
I
that kind
am.
of
Yes.
model. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I did Food Not Bombs for a long time in a lot of different cities. And, it was always like, there was never a question that we were going to add meat to anything in
Mm.
that kind of organization. So, um, yeah, so I don't know that I have any particular memories of like it being difficult in leftist spaces.
Okay.
Now, as I say that, yeah, I think there are definitely some people who are really into the academic ideology of certain things, and would say that veganism is frivolous and petit bourgeois, and something that is only the upper middle class is even considering this, and it's not really foundational to what we should be working on. And there's all kinds of interesting responses to that, but I don't engage with that too much, to be honest.
Yeah, it is so hilarious to me that sometimes people do pull out that perspective, which is hilarious because, veganism and plant-based foods, that was always the peasant foods, that's what the peasants ate. And it was only the elite rich that, ate the animal flesh.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And my body craves starch, like
Yeah.
I feel that like peasant DNA. So,
Right, right. Well, this is such an interesting story. Yeah, I used to live in New York City, and so Food Not Bombs was rather active there. So I did some stuff with them. And then in fact, I'm going to be in Kentucky this week, in fact, because I'm finishing my grad school program in clinical mental health counseling, and it's a school in Kentucky.
oh,
So,
cool.
yeah, yeah.
Where's
Um,
that?
it's in Williamsburg, Kentucky, which I don't
Yeah,
really know where it is. Kind of the middle of nowhere is my impression.
sure. Well, congratulations though.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. Like you, I went back to school again much
Yeah.
later. Yeah.
And I gotta say, when you invited me, I went and tried to listen to a couple episodes to get the feel, and I was amazed to learn that you're working with internal family systems.
Yes.
Yeah, it's just like a super interesting modality.
Agreed. Yeah. What's your association with IFS?
I came across it through a craniosacral practitioner here in town that I've worked with a bunch, and so no deep kind of association. I've had a couple sessions of it, kind of working through some things, but just find it fascinating. And actually, I'd like to have someone who's a little more experienced in it around town to. But everyone I talk to that I tell them about this idea, they're like, that is really cool and it sounds pretty relevant. So
Yeah, it makes so much sense. That's one thing I love about the modality is that it evolved organically. It wasn't, some psychologist just coming up with this concept out of nowhere. It's how we talk, oh, one part of me wants to do this and one part of me wants this. So he, it evolved organically in his work with clients who were wrestling with these different parts of themselves that had these different agendas. And he just ended up conceptualizing it and making it more accessible and laid out for people to practice. But yeah, that's funny that you're familiar with it. Although it doesn't surprise me just learning a little about you because it sounds like you're definitely a learner and somebody who explores all kinds of different ideas without staying in a particular lane. You don't strike me as someone who stays in your lane.
Yeah, don't we're making it up as we go along. I think that's a key idea in permaculture is that there isn't really a lane, right? Because we're just
Yeah.
sort of blundering into the future at this point, and the whole idea is can we bring some design and intentionality into that as a species, since we have a global society at this point. So, one of my favorite teachers, Dave Jackie, he has this quote of like we have to make as many mistakes as quickly as possible.
Hmm.
That's the only way to learn. So
Hmm.
I have
Hmm.
made a lot of mistakes in a lot of different realms in my life for sure.
Hmm. Yeah, so your vegan path kind of was parallel with your other professional path in the permaculture. When did you take your permaculture education and experience to the next level and start thinking, okay, I'm going to do this, for my vocation?
Yeah, I think it was actually when I went to college. And so I really credit that experience for helping to just sort of collate everything that was out there in terms of like the possible professional paths that I could take.
Mm,
And then sort of choose my own adventure from there by picking the relevant bits to say, okay, this is what it's going to mean to be a professional permaculturist. And I would have loved to just go work for somebody if there was somebody who was already doing what I'm doing, right? That
hmm
would have been the much easier step. Like I am not very well disposed to running a business per se, but it, has worked out pretty well. So, one thing that I think is important is that just having been vegan for so long before I got into permaculture, um, there was never any question of not having a vegan lens on whatever permaculture I was going to do. And I think that's pretty different from a lot of people that approach it, either because they're not vegan or because, maybe they came to permaculture first and veganism developed out of that. So that was in some ways limiting because I would see educational material about, quote unquote livestock or whatever, and I would just not be interested in it. In my later years, I've become more open to just learning about what different people are doing, and learning about complex system dynamics, just to understand a little better. But I'm still not advocating that people have a exploitative relationship with animals on any piece of land. Sorry, I'll give you a chance to react to that because I know it's a lot.
Yeah, no, that was a question I was curious about, was whether you were ever tempted to, leave veganism or, lapse in your veganism.
No, no.
No.
I mean, I've always said that if I like started to feel sick or something, like a joke, like I'll eat an egg or whatever. But that's never been a concern. Is the first
Yeah.
thing. And I certainly don't proselytize to other people about their own bodies and their own health needs and stuff like that. But for me, it has worked out really well. And now I've done a number of things that I would imagine a lot of vegans don't agree with or would even horrify listeners of your podcast. And it's just in the course of doing this work of if you're going to be hands-on, with the soil and really in some cases being pretty violent in terms of deciding what lives and dies on a landscape because you are asserting that you have a better idea, right? Like that's a pretty subjective kind of thing that you have to be able to philosophically chew on and explain to people as you go. So there's a lot of complexity in that we just kind of navigate as we go.
So
To
much complexity. And how
Yeah.
does that align, or does it, with, the Marxist mentality?
Yeah, so actually it aligns really well. That's a great question. I don't know how familiar you are with Marxist philosophy.
I mean, I know some of the basics, but why don't you break it down for people listening who may not know exactly what it is?
Yeah, I'll try. And I do have a short video on our YouTube channel. It's called Marxist Permaculture. But the,
Awesome.
the basic idea is, or the most relevant piece right here is that Marxism has this element called dialectics or dialectical thinking. And it's basically just a philosophical framework for approaching really complex systems where there are a bunch of interacting elements that are usually in some sort of dynamic opposition to each other, or what we say contradiction. And so there's this idea of a thesis, an antithesis, and then a synthesis that arises from those, the interaction of those elements. And, I'm greatly oversimplifying this, but the sort of reductionist Marxist take is that you can apply this dialectical thinking to just about anything, and kind of see things like how our bones are incredibly hard, but if you look at them microscopically, they actually look, there's a lot of empty space in between them, and they're very kind of thread-like in structure. And so these different contradictory elements, just depending on how we're looking at something, and being able to take all of that into account and not necessarily resolve ourselves to one fixed kind of idea, which is something that I think Western science is sort of guilty of. So that dialectical framework is, in my view, incredibly effective for talking about things like soil microbiology, or talking about other kinds of natural systems. And so having that Marxist framework to try and interpret what we're doing in the world is just immensely valuable.
I still don't, yeah, it's hard for me to see how that would translate into talking about soil.
Well, because the interactions in the soil are so complex that there comes a point where trying to break apart and individually understand every piece of it, which is sort of, if you're going to study soil microbiology, in some sense, you do a little bit of that. You want to isolate the microbes that are metabolizing a certain kind of phosphorus, let's say, and so that you can measure how they are, and you can do all these different things. But in the end, you have to consider the system as a whole living, and all the dynamic interactions, not just one little piece in a petri dish over here, separate from the rest of it over here. And it's only in that kind of level of consideration that you're going to get any sort of insight, or be able to have an actionable kind of result from whatever you're studying.
And so what about those decisions that you make that do, favor one life form over another life form? Do you wrestle with those? Do you feel guilty? Do you question yourself?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. Absolutely. And I do all kinds of accidental stuff too. I don't think it's possible to plant thousands of perennial herbaceous plugs with my little soil knife and not at some point, have killed an earthworm just in the course of what I'm doing. Right. And so that you experience that directly. It's right there in front of you. You did it. And so you have that moment. And then you have like the grinding alienation of there's a certain amount of time that it takes to plant each of those plugs. And if you want to complete this job and, get the money for it and whatever, you got to keep moving. And there isn't necessarily time to apologize and spend what really that moment might deserve with it. Yeah, that happens all the time. I think a really good example, my favorite example in the world actually, comes from that Beasts of Burden text that I mentioned. They said, for one thing, because they have in that text, they have an understanding of communism that closely aligns with my own, which is that communism is not a form of government. It's not a type of economy. It's not a system that you put into place. Rather, it's the word that we use to acknowledge the tendency in human history towards cooperation and community. So you can point out communist tendencies all throughout human history, and you can kind of see where the communist tendency exists in modern society and potentially try to remove barriers to it rather than control it or make other people put it into place or whatever. So that's important, I think. And so in that kind of view, they're talking about in this text in Beasts of Burden that communism is not a monolith. It's not the same way everywhere. And they have this example of the MST in Brazil, which is the landless workers movement. So something that I'm pretty familiar with in terms of it's a large social movement in Brazil. It was definitely a point of reference for a lot of people internationally in terms of land use and reclaiming, large farms that, from the rich and this kind of thing. And they're saying, hey, you have organized peasant movement, working class people who are seizing the land from capitalists and putting it into some sort of collective ownership and management. As part of that, there's animal husbandry. They're just, some of them have some goats, or they're doing this, they're doing that. That's, it came with it, and they are practicing that. That doesn't make it not communist, right? It goes back to that contradiction. We have to understand that every system has some contradiction in it. And actually, they, in the development of their communal stewardship of the land, in the development of non-capitalist social relations, etc., that's going to be a more conducive environment for conversations about our relationship to animals to emerge, because it won't be this theoretical thing that we're just sort of parachuting in. It's rather a direct consequence of the material work that we're doing. So we don't try to guide things so much as create the situations in which those conversations will emerge.
So interesting. Yeah. There's so much there. But you mentioned George Orwell, who, to my knowledge, he's not thought of as pro-communist.
He's not. It's fascinating, right? Because he was a lifelong. I think he described himself as a democratic socialist, and he wrote some of his books, kind of obviously criticizing the authoritarian state kind of forms of capitalism that evolved in places like the Soviet Union. And this, of course, was ideologically very useful to defenders of capitalism in the 20th century, who could take some of his works and say, hey, you got to read Animal Farm. You got to read 1984. Nobody ever mentioned that he wrote this thing called Homage to Catalonia. Don't read that. That's not, it blew my mind. I'd never heard that Orwell had written this book, let alone gone and fought in the Civil War himself on the side of Trotskyist or left-wing militia. So
That's fascinating. I didn't know that either. I reread 1984 a few years ago when there was a lot of stuff going on in the outside world, and it was horrifying to reread and just feel like, oh my goodness, in many ways we're going through this again. But just generally speaking, you mentioned your social justice activism and trying to overthrow capitalist systems and governments. What was and or is your vision for what's going to replace them, these systems?
yeah, so that's the classic question, right? And it gets back to that example of the MST, and that it's going to be contradictory. It's going to be different in every place. And in a lot of cases, it's going to be most directly informed by the conditions under which we either replace or overthrow or coexist with some form of whatever is already in power, right? So in a lot of cases, you might have a situation where the existing government kind of steps aside and says, yeah, this isn't working anymore, clearly. In other cases, that's not what's going to happen. And we've seen, obviously, lots of historical precedents with that. And so what we do is we study in history how these movements look, because there's actually, if you really read the news and all that, there's revolutions happening all the time, several a year all over the world. But they don't necessarily consolidate power. They don't necessarily actually threaten the existing property relations that underlie kind of our political system in many parts of the world. And so studying that, understanding that, and hopefully learning from it is what's going to inform our ability to hopefully build an alternative. But that alternative has to be built, we're sort of, there's a metaphor somewhere, but you're building the ship while you're sailing it or whatever. It's definitely hazardous. And we make a lot of mistakes along the way. So it's exactly like with permaculture, trying to relearn from indigenous food systems, adapt them to present day, to changes in climate and that kind of thing. In a lot of cases, this is ancestral knowledge that, due to genocide was removed from the landscape. And so we have to make a lot of mistakes with communism, with the construction of a post-capitalist society. No one's ever done it before. So we have these little glimpses, like in Russia, like in Spain. And then we have, of course, the mistakes that were made, and we have to learn from those. But, we are constantly under completely different material conditions because of the advancements of technology, in some cases because of the destruction of natural resources and maybe established international values that previously we could have taken for granted in terms of trying to project the future. A lot of stuff is up in the air right now. So Marx always gets kind of criticized for, well, he never gave a blueprint of like, what are we supposed to do? But that is kind of the point, is that everybody that was contemporary with Marx had been trying to do this and they were all wrong. And he said, no, we have to actually root whatever we're doing in the material process of disassembling the capitalist system that exists. And so it's going to be dynamic. It's not going to be something that you can necessarily predict ahead of time.
And not something that's going to look the same community by community.
Exactly.
Yeah. Very, very interesting. Yeah, I have so many questions, so many directions I could go in. But do you still struggle with existential questions, or have you found your purpose?
No, I mean, I'm still seeking a few things. I still have things in my life that I'd like to accomplish that don't really have much to do with permaculture. But yeah, so I guess what I'm grappling with right now, the most recent sort of existential dread in my life, is codependence. This is a new framework for me. I've never, in my life, I've researched things. I said, maybe I might have ADHD and it's undiagnosed, or like, oh, maybe I'm on the spectrum somewhere, whatever. This is a new one in my, my
Repertoire.
hypochondriac
Yeah.
kind of research is like, maybe I'm codependent. And so, looking back at my life, there's just lots of things, that I think are valuable. And most of them are things that I can't do by myself. So overthrowing capitalism is one of them, right? You need to get organized. You need other people to be on the same page as you, and all these kinds of things. And so looking back at my life right now, I'm wondering about what are the things that I didn't do, the things that, maybe I should have just gone and done by myself. And so there's a little bit of that in Geomancer because it's a company and I just started it, as a single kind of owner thing. And there's a reaction to that. There's a reason why I'm not a nonprofit. I don't want to deal with a board and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's where I'm going right now, and kind of wondering about this responsibility that I've taken on now that, at least here locally, there's a lot of people looking at our projects, and they are very long-term things, right? We're putting trees in the ground and basically making a covenant with that landscape that, like, hey, I know it's going to take 7 years for this to really look like something, but I'm going to be here the whole time. I'm going to work with it. I'm going to continue to educate people about it. And, for someone who, used to move to a new town every 6 months to a year, that's a lot. It's a lot. So
Yeah.
that's what I'm working with.
Yeah. Very interesting. So it sounds like some of what you're doing is a response to perhaps past codependent patterns. Is that accurate?
Yeah, I mean, subconsciously, right? I mean, literally, like in the last month, have I been researching what codependence is, and kind of being like, oh, that pattern does kind of fit. Like, I do tend to date people, like, like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. Very interesting, because hearing your story, I mean, you sound like, the rebel, the revolutionary. You don't think of those people typically as being codependent. You think of those people as being the outliers, the loners, and just people out there in the cabin in the woods. How do you reconcile those aspects of yourselves?
My goodness, I don't know if I have, that's the something about the chaos within, right?
Right.
Yeah. I mean, to some extent, yeah, I think I mentioned a little bit of spirituality before, and this is one of those concepts where I think I've spent enough lifetimes like meditating in a cave. It doesn't feel like that's what we're here to do right now. Feels like this moment in history is like a little bit bigger, and it's asking just a little bit more from us, and it's asking for us to be together actually right now, especially after we've been through this period, particularly with the global pandemic, where we all kind of went inside a little bit and got like real comfortable with like what's going on with me, and so as a inhalation exhalation kind of deal, it feels like we need to get into the whatever that next phase of the cycle is, and which is kind of coming out and being together. So that just feels like, what's sort of in the zeitgeist, regardless of what my preference is that we should be doing that work. We need to come together. But the rest of it, some of it is just the same deal, that the things that are important to me, they're too big for me to do by myself. It's too big of a lift. But you have that idea of like, if we all just pushed on this boulder at the same time, we could actually move it. And kind of anticipating that cathartic sort of experience. And when you get little tastes of it, when you do get people together, we have some projects that have been very successful, that have been transformative for people. They've had the experience of really just altering the landscape. And so that's really powerful, because you change the material conditions of your environment. And for a lot of us, that's something we don't have the opportunity to do in modern society, right? We're totally alienated from where our food comes from and what our neighborhoods look like and stuff like that. So that's as a Marxist, that's how we use permaculture as the tool for generating communism, for removing the obstacles to that community.
But I'm sure you don't tell your customers that for the most part.
No, we do.
You do, really?
Goodness. Absolutely. I mean, there's a hammer and sickle in the company logo. It's we're completely blatant about it.
Interesting. Yeah.
And to be fair, I don't make a lot of money. We haven't figured that part out yet. We're doing crowdfunding. We mostly get grants. I work with a lot of schools and churches and city governments and stuff, more so than like your residential clients. So that has been really nice, because in this field, I can be, I hate to use this term, but a little bit of an expert, right? People are hiring Geomancer as the company to come and tell them what to do.
Yeah.
So a lot of times, thankfully, I don't have to justify many of these. I mean, I explain obviously the rationale behind our design process and the decisions that we're making. And for the most part, the kind of people who call us in to try and fix a problem, maybe some other people have been there already and that didn't work out. And so they're ready to listen to us. So that's really cool. But no, it's foundational to all of our marketing, for, if you want to call it that, that we are sort of in the trench coat of an LLC, but we are absolutely aspiring to be a revolutionary movement.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's so interesting. And you mentioned your spiritual path from atheist to where you are now. Yeah. Do you want to talk a little about that trajectory?
I can try. I would say I became like a hardcore atheist in like third grade or something. So, being from Brazil, Catholic family, not a hardcore Catholic upbringing, but I did, I was taken to Sunday school and stuff.
Yeah.
And then I can never remember, I'm sorry to the Catholics who may be listening. I'm not trying to say anything sacrilegious.
I was raised Catholic too. Yeah.
Okay. So, well, maybe you can help me. I think is it first communion or confirmation? Which one happens first? Confirmation?
Communion is first. Yeah.
So whichever the first one was, however old I was at that age.
Yeah. That would have been about second grade or third grade. Yeah.
Yeah, so I was like, this is bullshit. And, I remember standing and watching all the kids go off to the church to do it. And at that, I was like, I'm done. I'm not doing this anymore. And I'm atheist.
What was it that you questioned? I mean, was there one particular thing?
Not really, like I think I was just super bored. I remember sitting in church and okay, everybody's praying. So this is kind of, I'm gonna do it, and God wasn't talking to me. I really, not that I knew how to listen as a kid, but I felt like I was, really straining to hear any kind of voice of divinity, or whatever, and it just wasn't there. And so I was mostly, I think I resented that I was being made to go to church and have all these things. And I didn't feel like I was getting real value out of it. And I'm sure kind of the background hum to all of that is, the whole, the sense of wait, our society is screwed. Why, It just didn't line up, right?
Yeah. Why are you focusing on this stuff when, yeah, this is what we're dealing with?
Right. Or if this is the ultimate moral value being, and here is the evident kind of consequence of it played out on the landscape, why would I ever listen to you? Right. So
Right.
just that
Exactly.
question.
Yeah. You don't have any credibility in terms of
Exactly.
your solution
Exactly.
you're offering. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And then, so then I stayed, and that was like a pretty comfortable way to be when I became a communist and all this kind of stuff, because there's lots of people out there who are like, if you are a Marxist, therefore you are an atheist. And that was just kind of what I took for granted for a while. And I wasn't, I got to say, I wasn't like a hardcore atheist. I wasn't out there like trying to have debates with Christians or anything like that. That was
Mm-hmm.
never my
Mm-hmm.
thing. So it wasn't like I had a whole developed ideology around it.
Yeah.
But then as I got older and increasingly so doing work with nature, you just have too many experiences that are like, oh, okay, there's more to all of this. Like whatever this is just one cross section that I'm looking at like from the side. And so I see some of it, but there there's definitely an understanding at this point in my life that there's a lot that I'm not seeing.
Yeah. Yeah. And how does that translate into your daily life, or does it?
Well, I will say I'm not the best spiritual practitioner. Like I don't have a really daily kind of set practice around it. I have adopted things over the course of my life, even just like having a photo. I mentioned some of my ancestors, having their photo on a mantle is like a very intentional kind of spiritual practice
Mm.
that I've adopted. So certain things like that. I have done a lot of work over the course of over a decade now with a practice that I guess people call it different things, but inner landscape work is basically a meditation where you kind of uh, go down into a sort of more relaxed, state of mind and have this visualization experience with a landscape that is yours to tend.
Mm.
And the sort of metaphors of what happened there relate to your daily life. So maybe you have a
Mm.
garden in this landscape and you spend some time in your meditation pulling the weeds from it. And
Mm.
that could maybe be, you're getting rid of kind of the brambles in your social interactions or things like that. And so I've had some pretty amazing experiences in my life through developing that practice. That's really a core piece of what I do, and then some other ones as well. But I will say, I think it's no joke. The spiritual benefits of veganism are serious, in the sense again of just one less thing you have to worry about.
Yeah.
Right? What kind of experiences are open to you on the landscape when you don't smell like a predator is something that a lot of people don't think about. So I was already vegan when I started some sort of spiritual practice, but I have noticed absolutely certain things that I don't think would have been possible, or I would have
Mm.
had just a different kind of road to them entirely had I not been vegan.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I totally agree about veganism and spirituality. Although I hadn't acquainted it so much with the scent as much, but that makes total sense about smelling like a predator. But I still remember at a vegan meetup I went to in New York City years ago, chatting with this man who he was really nice. He'd grown up Christian, and he had gone vegan for health reasons because he had gotten type 2 diabetes. Everyone in his family had it, and people had limbs amputated. So he went vegan for health reasons. But he was a religious guy. He said to me, since going vegan, I've never felt closer to Jesus. And I'm not religious. I'm more of a spiritual heathen at this point. But when he said that, it just made so much sense because, of course, how could you not, feel closer to the divine, whatever the divine is for you, when you're not consuming the products of torture and suffering and violence. So yeah, it all makes total sense to me. And what you were saying about codependence versus needing other people, one of my teachers, the way he used to frame it, and in fact his whole way of counseling people frames it, is just, the aim isn't, we don't want to be codependent, obviously, but we also can't be completely self-sufficient. We can't be rigidly independent. That's not workable. So the situation we're looking for is interdependence. Like we all need each
Yes.
other. We all contribute. We're not codependent in that we don't have to have people be a certain way for us to be okay. But, we give, we take, we all do our thing and work together. And like you said, accomplish things that we never could by ourselves. But the challenge, of course, is getting to that point, especially when people come in with their differing agendas and differing values and different lenses. Like you mentioned how you're so clear that you're seeing one slice, one piece, one angle, and everybody is seeing their own particular slice and piece and angle. And how the heck are we ever supposed to even have it's, to me, it's almost miraculous we even managed to have a conversation, given that we're living in these different realities. But one of the questions that I'm curious about is just your view of humanity in general, and humans on the planet. Do you consider us a plague on the planet? Are we just another animal? Like where do we lie in your view?
I don't think we lie anywhere separate from anything else, right? Like we are one contiguous universe. We are all an unbreakable extension of the infinite, whatever that may be. And so, according to what we want to do, if there's like a practical thing that I want to do, I might zoom in or zoom out, and it becomes useful to see myself as separate, or see to
Mm-hmm.
collaborate with Chrissy, rather than to understand that actually there's not two people having the conversation here, right? Um, so, God, I mean, I got lost in that for a moment, but the thing about humans being a plague is so interesting. I actually just talked about this a couple days ago. I was invited to speak to a Baptist congregation, of all things, and so I spoke about the concept of dominion, which is philosophically pretty relevant to the vegan community, I think.
have
But
you have you read a book called Dominion?
I
It's a
haven't. I have
vegan
not. I'm
text.
familiar with it. Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
yeah. I'll be honest. I have not exposed myself to the vast majority of popular vegan media in the recent period, for a variety of reasons. But yeah, I'm aware of it, and I think it's such a potent kind of discourse.
It was really interesting. I mean, he points out, and it was written by somebody who was a former speechwriter for George W. Bush, I believe. So someone not from the left in the slightest. But he talks about dominion. He says, for instance, if two parents have two boys at home and they go out one night and say to the older son, okay, while we're gone, you've got dominion over your younger brother. you know, that the concept of dominion implies some care and some consideration. And so when they come home, they don't expect the brother who had dominion to have, chopped up his little brother and thrown him on the grill. You know?
Yes.
So
Yeah.
yeah, just the whole conception of dominion as it's used to justify animal exploitation is counter to the spirit of it, and is the argument that this author makes.
Yeah. No, I love that example, because it's like, yeah, mom and dad are coming home, and what state is the house going to be in?
Right,
Right. Like
right.
spiritually, the ultimate question is kind of that, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and so, yeah, and that there's a responsibility to it. It's not this open invitation to rapacious despoiling of whatever you have domination over. It's rather that you have a domain that you're working in.
Hmm.
Um, so yeah, but to more kind of discreetly answer your question, the plague thing. is something that I deal with all the time in ecology and in permaculture. There's tons of people who are like, I'm sick of society. People are a virus. People are the invasive species, especially white people. And, and then it often leads them into, I'm going to go have my homestead up in the mountains by
Yeah.
myself, away
Yeah.
from everybody else. And the other place it leads them is, well, I'm not going to give any of my money to so-called social causes. I'm going to donate to preserve a little postage stamp of biodiversity out in the middle of nowhere that no one will ever see.
Hmm.
Right. So I deal with that a lot.
Hmm.
And I try to combat those tendencies because I'm an urban ecologist. I come from a giant city. I don't have, any kind of rural inclination necessarily. And as an ecologist, I think about the density of population in human cities as being one of our greatest resources, actually. So it's kind of dialectically flipping ecology on its head, because I deal with a lot of conservationists who say the best thing we can do for wild communities is keep people out of them, make sure that they are, secret and safe and whatever. And actually, the case that we're trying to make is that these communities, whatever you want to think of as the native flora and ecology of North America, um, didn't just evolve that way by accident. It was intentionally selected by the indigenous people here. It is a managed polyculture.
Hmm.
And we don't get to have that community and those dynamics unless we also kind of restore the social ties and life ways that created them in the first place. So you don't get to separate people from the rest of nature. You don't get to save nature without people.
Hmm.
And you don't get to have a little, nature preserve for rich people without also thinking about how does everybody else get housing? How does everybody else get food? Those are eminently ecological questions.
Yeah. Yeah. So no easy answers, it sounds like. But this idea of nature being separate and, the beautiful preserves being out there as the separate, it almost strikes me as the idea of putting nature in a museum that we like
Yeah,
go visit or something.
it's colonial. It's
Yeah.
openly kind of and genocidal of these sort of human relations to the landscape that predate our kind of our modern conception of the rest of the world as being this inert object that we can impose our will on. And of course, the knock-on effects of that. I mean, how is there's so much sort of degradation in humanity of human to humans that is predicated on the dehumanization of another people. And why would that work unless we also, had no respect for the non-human world? If we value and respect and see the non-human world as, our relatives, as actually an extension of ourselves,
Right.
and certainly of the creation, it doesn't become possible to dehumanize anyone.
Right. Right. Yeah. Are you familiar with the book The World Peace Diet by Will
Mm-mm.
Tuttle? Well,
No.
that's the book. I consider that my vegan Bible because it really goes deep into just, even deeper than traditional animal rights literature, but just into the spiritual connections. And just that's one of the points that the author Will Tuttle makes very, very well, is that what we do to non-human animals, we inevitably do to humans. Everything we're doing to humans, in most cases, we practiced on the non-human animals. I mean, I still remember going to a talk after there was this expose published about Tyson Foods. And this was when I was living in New York City, and I went to hear the author speak. And the focus of the book was the exploitation of the farmers, how the workers were treated, all of this stuff about the humans involved. And I have no doubt that they were, treated abysmally and exploited and manipulated and, treated as less than human. And, but he never mentioned, oh, well, they also do this to the birds. And, where do you think they learned that mentality of otherization? And so I I got to make that point in the Q&A. And it was just really interesting speaking with the author afterwards, because he had said, unfortunately, even though it's a horrible company, they're really the only supplier of chicken. And I don't like it, but where else am I going to get my chicken? And so I went up and talked to him. I actually don't eat chickens. It had never even crossed his mind. But yeah, just fascinating how these mentalities get drummed into us and we don't even realize how we're perpetuating them. So yeah, I think you would dig this book for sure. If you're going to read something, that's
Yeah.
definitely the one.
No, that sounds like a great recommendation,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
very there's so much in there, right? Because talking about the workers, I mean, even in that particular dialogue sounds like at the expense of also noticing that the animals are involved in this system, but it gives you a point of departure for like Marxist veganism, that we can really look at the economic implications on the lives of people who are involved in the animal industry and say this is not for the benefit of anyone.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Well, I've got just a couple more questions for you. But one that I
Yeah, let's
wanted
do
to
it.
ask was because I discovered your work through a friend of mine here in Nashville, Tennessee, who I think she was taken aback that, and again, maybe this is not accurate, but she told me that you had said that if you're not vegan, you can't be a true Marxist. I'm just wondering if that's
No,
your view or
that's bizarre. No, I
okay.
certainly, and I'll go back to
I might
the
have it wrong. I might have it wrong. Yeah.
no, and it gets confusing too, because in Marxism, which is I think a good thing, we strive for a great deal of specificity in what we're talking
Mm.
about. But if you are talking to people who aren't trained Marxists, it can be a little difficult to, right? There's just the vernacular of kind of the bubble that we live in. And so you have to differentiate Marxism as a specific philosophical tendency that we utilize as a tool from communism as the real existing movement in history. And so, but I don't think in either case, like, you don't have to be a vegan to be a real Marxist or to be a real communist or anything like that. And I refer back to that Beasts of Burden text and the example of the landless workers movement in Brazil. And they have a corresponding example of the animal liberation movement in the UK, which was mostly kind of based around anarchist sort of ideas, but that even though they were vegan, they were vegan, but then they were put into this situation with the miners' strike in the 80s where they were being asked to, or rather they were being compelled to participate in solidarity with working class communities that ate meat, and that there was a bunch of tension there. And so, yeah, just to say that it's all, very interesting, and there's a lot of different things to chew on there, but no, I would not make that claim. Certainly not.
But there are certain alignments, obviously, that you see between the two.
Well, I think for the work that we're trying to do with Geomancer, we are a vegan company, and we make that pretty apparent. We ask that people not bring animal products to our events. If we're serving food or anything like that, it's always going to be vegan. And that's just because of the work that we're doing with earth repair. We need to create a certain set of conditions for that work to be more effective.
Mm-hmm.
But the majority of people that I work with and who affiliate with Geomancer are not vegan.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense because the majority of people just in general are not vegan. So
Right,
yeah.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
But increasingly, we do find people who are, you know how it is when you find another vegan in the wild. They're just like, thank God. and
Yeah.
and so it is pretty cool to have the company sort of have that stance. And in some cases, we've had people who like really take an issue with that and just like,
Mm.
what do you mean? Like, what are you trying to say? And what if some indigenous people showed up? Would you tell them that their food's not what? Just all these kinds of bizarre hypotheticals.
Mm-hmm.
And that's a really easy kind of barometer right off the bat to be like, you know what, like you're not the kind of person that we're trying to work with right now. We're trying to do something a little more delicate and intentional. So
Right. Right. Yeah, that makes sense. That makes
yeah,
sense.
I would say gatekeeping is sacred. Gatekeeping gets a very bad rap, but it is actually one of the most important things we can do if we want to be effective.
Yeah. And especially if you're working in a communal sense or trying to build communities, yeah, you need to figure out who that community is going to work for.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, thank you so much for sharing this fascinating, fascinating information and just ideas. Definitely a non-traditional, interesting path, which is kind of our favorite kind here at the Vegan Posse. Um,
Yeah.
so, the final question I have that I like to ask all my guests is: there a particular word that for you sums up what being vegan is all about?
Oh man. You know, I'm I'm kicking myself because I listened to other episodes. I knew this was coming, but you know, what's coming up is responsibility.
Mm, mm,
Because I think that is a really powerful paradigm for everything in your life.
mm,
And it can be difficult, especially when there are circumstances that are definitely not our fault that we're living through. But to the extent that we take responsibility for everything that happens in our lives, um, we will, you know, be able to move forward and be effective. And
mm,
so I think veganism is, it goes back to that interpretation of dominion, that it's a responsibility and we have
mm.
to take it seriously.
Yeah, I like that a lot. I don't think that's a word I've heard before as an answer, but I like that a lot because you hear the word responsibility and it doesn't sound like a fun word. But if you kind of break it down to the roots, like, you know, the ability to respond effectively, then it seems much more fluid and dynamic and holistic. So, yeah, good one.
Mm.
Good one.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me on. This was really
Oh,
fun.
my pleasure. Yeah, anytime. And we close every episode by taking 30 seconds of silence for all the suffering animals, human and non human, who desire, as we all do, safety, happiness, and the freedom to live out their lives without interference. So, Nachie, I invite you to join me in 30 seconds of silence for the animals, and we'll conclude with the sound of the bell. Thank you, Nachie, and thank you, Posse. See you next time. Until then, stay strong and stay true.
See ya.
Thank you so much. That was so